All right, so we are going to talk about emotion today. A very tricky subject to study in general. You'll notice in today's lecture and in the next lecture that the field is still very divided on how to define this, how to kind of pick it apart. There's a lot going on with emotion because everything that we've kind of talked about so far has involved kind of just the brain. I mean, we talked about action and muscles and all this, but emotion involves almost every physiological process in your body. Feeling what your body feels like, all of these hormones and everything that's going on. So emotion's a really, really tricky subject, but there's a lot of really cool advances in cognitive neuroscience that are helping us kind of pin down what it is and how it's distributed and things like that. So we're going to start today by kind of looking at the difficulties in defining emotion. And without a proper definition of emotion, it makes it really hard to study. Because if two people are defining something in a different way, they're coming to different conclusions that don't really mesh with one another. So we're going to see how the field has kind of been struggling with that, because some people fall on one side of the debate and some people fall on the other. We're going to explore some neural mechanisms that have kind of come out of these different ideas. And then at the end, we're going to look at how researchers are attempting to categorize these things, because it's a lot like with memory. There were a lot of different facets to memory. Emotions the same way. There's a ton of different types of emotions, happiness and anger, sadness, that all kind of rely on different neural structures, that rely on different physiological processes. So this is a very, very kind of muddy topic. And so just focus on some of the takeaways that I want you to take from this that would be on the test, but know that this is a very evolving field. And it's one that a lot of researchers are kind of on the forefront of. So it's a big reason why our culture is so obsessed with emojis. Emojis represent this idea that the face is very, very predictive of what we're feeling, of what's going on in our head and going on in our body. And we have so many different descriptions that kind of get this whole message across really, really fast and really easy. I mean, we talked in object recognition about the fact that the fusiform face area lights up for just faces, like really, really robust for just faces. And that's because faces are super, super important for making social decisions, for deciding what's important to someone that we're interacting with, right? So as this whole field has kind of emerged, something that I've kind of hinted at is that it's really, really difficult to really define what it is that emotion actually is. And we'll kind of explore some different ways that people have kind of taken a stab at this, but this is something that has really come out of the literature that's kind of common amongst a lot of these different theories, is that emotions are embodied, right? They involve all of these physiological processes. We feel them, and it's because of all of these things that are happening with our organs and things like that. This was a really cool study over here. This wasn't done from imaging or anything like that. They had people, they gave them two bodies that were just black. And then they had them think about what fear was or what anger was or all of these different things. And they had them draw where they felt those emotions on these bodies, where they felt things activating on one body and where they felt them deactivating on another body. So red and yellow is where they feel activation during these emotions. And then blue is where they felt deactivation. And so some really interesting things, like if you look at depression and shame and sadness, they all have very similar representations to people in like the legs and the arms, this like deactivating feeling that they have. You have anger being felt kind of in the chest and in the arms. Look at how bright the hands are with anger, right? Your fists clenching up, those kind of things. So really, really interesting study. Keep in mind, this was all kind of subjective ratings and things like that, but this was averaged across tons and tons of people that have done this. And when you're looking at these, you really can kind of put yourself back in that feeling state. And you can kind of see like, oh yeah, that is where I feel that emotion. That is where I feel this. Emotions are recognizable, right? We can see it on someone's face. And we know that happiness has a very specific look. We know that sadness has a very specific look. And so facial expressions, behavioral patterns are all things that kind of give away clues as to what we are recognizing. And we've seen that there are parts of the brain that are like devoted to doing this. They're triggered by emotionally salient stimuli. So this is This is something that kind of differentiates this from mood, and we'll kind of talk about mood, but mood is something that doesn't really have a definable trigger. Emotions are believed to be something that are kind of short-lived and have something that set that emotion off. And this is how we study them, because we want to be able to induce that emotion. And they're less susceptible to our intentions than other cognitive type processes that we have. Like we're really good at directing our attention or kind of bringing up memories and things like this. But emotions are believed to be really hard to control. And this has been something that has been talked about for hundreds of years in the philosophical literature. It's kind of your emotional self versus your rational self. This is something that's just, it happens. I mean, and we'll see that there's a whole cascade of physiology that happens. Once one of these emotions is triggered, these feelings are happening for a reason, and they're happening because of this cascade of hormones that has been released. It's kind of hard to stop that process once it's started. And so these are just some things to really kind of think about as we start characterizing what an emotion is and how we study it, because these are important to the reasons we do the things that we do when we study them. One of the biggest kind of downfalls, I guess you can say, is the fact that most of what we know about emotion comes from subjective self-reports. And I say this is kind of a bad thing because there's a lot of debate about whether or not we actually are good at describing our emotions, if we're good at subjective reporting in general. There's a lot of people that kind of doubt things that come from these subjective ratings. There's a lot of things that influence these subjective ratings of researcher bias and wanting someone to view you in a certain way. I'm going to choose that I'm not sad because I want the researcher to not think that I'm sad. Things like that. There's a lot of stuff that goes into whether or not these things can be trusted. But this is all we really have to go off of. We can't really do a lot of animal research on emotions because of the fact that they can't subjectively report things. And even when we look at physiological type stuff that's going on, we usually link that physiological stuff to a subjective report to validate it. So subjective reports are really, really big when we're talking about emotion. We'll see later in the lecture that there are ways which they think that we can study this in animals. I'll kind of leave it up to you guys as to whether or not you think that that's applicable or not, but we'll get there. So just know that a lot of what we know about emotion could have this kind of underlying bias associated with it. So I wanted to put this up here. This is a really lengthy quote, but this was done by this guy, Izard, in 2010. He went through all of these different definitions that 35 different researchers had used for emotion and kind of compiled it. And I'll kind of point out a couple of things that will be kind of specific to what we're going to talk about. So this first line, emotion consists of neural circuits, and then parentheses, that are at least partially dedicated. That's going to be important when we get into things about the debate about whether or not emotions are specific or whether they're kind of diffuse. There are people that think that happiness involves a happiness circuit and anger involves an anger circuit. But there's a lot of evidence that shows that it's not that clear cut. And so they're saying that these neural circuits are partially dedicated to a certain emotion. They involve response systems. That's involving the physiological type processes of hormone release and all that kind of stuff. And then a feeling that motivates and organizes cognition. And so this is kind of where that subjective report comes from. Being able to actually feel those hormone releases and what it's doing to our body. And this cognitive appraisals is going to kind of come up in the next lecture, but it's our idea of deciding whether or not this is a good or a bad thing that's happening to us. And then we kind of talked about this, that a lot of this is used for social signaling. It's used to kind of motivate whether we should approach someone or withdraw from someone. A lot of those emotions, we'll see that there's like approach and withdraw type theories of emotion about if that's kind of the evolutionary purpose of them, is to encourage us to interact with people or to pull away from people. And then they think that a lot of this is to be social or relational in nature. And a lot of the brain regions that have been kind of proposed as emotion centers are brain regions that are really only there with social animals, with mammals. So really kind of an interesting point there. So this is one of the big debates in the field. about how to define what the emotion is. Is the emotion the entire experience? Is it all of the physiology? Is it all of the hormone release, everything, including the neural response and all of that? Or is it just the neural activity that starts all of that? And that's kind of where a lot of these definitions kind of fall short, is trying to figure out whether or not the emotion, the subjective feeling that we have, is just happening in our brain, or if it's kind of this whole network emergent property of the whole system, the whole physiological thing happening. And so this kind of breaks down what those two look like. So this would be kind of a whole system approach. They involve changes across tons of different response systems. And so our emotional experience over here on the right is actually involving all of these different things. And we're kind of putting all of those different things into this emotional experience box and then reporting on it. It's important to note that they're distinctive from moods. This was something I kind of hinted at. I'll have a slide where I actually talk about like what mood is. But emotions themselves have identifiable triggers. That's something that really sets them apart from moods. Moods are a lot more long-lasting. So these things can be learned or unlearned. Appraisal processes refers to the type that when we're doing these subjective reportings, we're talking about whether or not this whole system is good or bad. And this is another important point of this like whole system approach. I didn't highlight it, I'm not going to test you on it, but it's this idea that it involves kind of a ton of different neural processes all together. And so the kind of idea here is just that the whole system approach is talking about the fact that everything is kind of being taken into account when we're talking about this subjective feeling. Whereas on the other end of this is the kind of neural activity approach. And this talks about how we have this internal central nervous system state. And so this is something that we feel sad, and that sadness that we feel is in our head, is in our emotional circuitry in our brain. And that once we feel sad and we're able to report that we feel sad, then that starts to cascade and create all of these different things that are happening. So this is a very different approach. It's saying that like the feeling, the subjectiveness is totally separate from all of the stuff that's going on in our body, all of the cognitive changes. And that the subjective reports kind of come out of this emotion circuitry in the brain and not necessarily from all the physiology. And this is here. This is very similar to the last one. So both of them kind of believe these emotions are triggered by something, but you have some kind of stimuli, some kind of, let's say like a negative picture that causes the brain to do kind of an appraisal process of deciding like what that stimuli is going to do to us. And then it sends signals to start all of this other stuff that's happening. And so this is kind of what I was just hinting at, that the activation from the circuits itself is what gives rise to all of this stuff. And so from a whole system approach, what we talked about on the last slide, the subjective feeling would be kind of after the fact, describing everything that had just happened to the body. Whereas with this, we're describing it before a lot of these changes have happened. We're deciding that we're sad, and then because of that, all of these hormone releases and everything are kind of being triggered. So out of that, regardless of the fact that there's kind of this split in the field, the three things that everybody agrees on is that there is some type of physiological reaction. So this does involve some type of hormone release. It involves all of the organs kind of participating in some way. It involves some type of response behaviorally. This is kind of the recognizable point. It's something that we can see on another individual. We can see it in their face. We can see it in their outward behavior to other people. We know when someone's angry and they're walking at us with their fist clenched, kind of a thing. And we know that they have subjective reports that come out of it, that they have a feeling that can be defined by the individual. Cool. So this just kind of differentiates, I wasn't able to, for some reason, to do animations with this. I wish I could do these one at a time. But I wanted to kind of differentiate how these three terms are different than the term emotion. So affect over here on the left, you'll commonly hear people talk about affective neuroscience. And affect itself is just kind of an umbrella term that includes all of these things. So it's talking about short-lived emotions, it's talking about really long-lived moods, and it's also talking about stress states, cortisol release, and all those kind of things. So affect is talking about the whole field. Everything that can be considered a feeling, basically, is kind of under this umbrella affect term. Stress itself is talking about what is happening physiologically to the body during times of hardship, things that put you into this kind of fight or flight type mode. It involves these neurohormonal changes, and it disrupts homeostasis. That's kind of the important part here, is that stress itself kind of puts you into this like supercharged mode where you're depressing your immune system, you're like increasing your glucose stores so that the body has energy to fight and things like that. So stress itself is just referring to kind of the physiological properties of hardship. And then mood is something that I've hinted at. Mood is kind of this long-lasting thing. And it's usually something that doesn't have a very clear, identifiable trigger. And so these are a lot more diffuse. They're a lot trickier to kind of hone in on if you were to try to put someone in a scanner or something like that. Emotions are something that we can trigger. We can see when it turns on. We can see when it turns off. Moods are these long-lasting things that are really hard to study. So affect, umbrella term that describes all of it. Emotion, stress, mood. Stress is the physiological components. Hardship, it's what's happening when you're going into this fight or flight type state. And then mood is kind of an amalgam of all of these different things coming together. The different stress and the different types of emotions and everything kind of puts you into this global state, this mood. And so now we'll talk about some of the different circuitry that's been proposed as being involved in a lot of these processes. And we'll kind of start with what they thought at first and kind of work into what cognitive neuroscience is kind of leading to and kind of what's the cutting edge in this field. And so we'll start with just this idea that there's not a really clear picture. And a lot of that is kind of revolving around this fact that if we haven't clearly defined it, that's why like consciousness is so hard to study. Like we've never really defined what consciousness is. And because of that, it's really hard to put different results from different researchers together. And so it's hard to kind of come to a consensus as to what exact brain regions are involved. And this is something that kind of makes it even trickier, is this idea that the emotion itself is tied into all of these other cognitive processes that we've talked about, right? You have sensory information that's coming in that our attention systems are picking up. And that sensory information represents this kind of emotional stimuli. So attention is being employed to pick up what's important. Memory processes are being turned on to see whether or not that thing was bad in the past, whether it was good in the past, so we can make appraisals about it. And then after all of that, we have these physiological reactions that are coordinated by kind of these under the hood, kind of black boxy autonomic nervous system type processes. And so it's really hard to really nail down if you're looking at the brain while someone is viewing a really good picture or a really negative picture. It's hard to say that's emotion because there's tons of stuff going on. But one of the things that we know is going on kind of under the hood is the physiological stuff that we talked about being common between all of these different emotions. And a lot of that is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is what I want you guys to tie to the physiological components. This is what is actually giving us the feelings that we have, the shiver up your spine, right? When you're really afraid and you're shaking, a lot of that stuff is out of your control. You're not sending commands to start shaking. Your body is just kind of putting you into that zone. When you're kind of in this fight or flight mode, you have a bunch of resources that are being reallocated so that you can be in a fight mode rather than in like a protective or runaway type mode. And so this is kind of what I hinted at. It's outside of the direct cognitive control. And this is a brain region I want you guys to remember. We talked about this on like the second day when we were going through kind of broad anatomy. But the hypothalamus is kind of the point in the brain where a lot of this stuff is coordinated. Physiological stuff is coordinated. It's what starts a lot of the hormone release to cause all of these cascades that happen that then start your heart beating and start directing glucose and insulin and all that kind of stuff in different ways. They divert blood away from your stomach because we don't want to be spending a bunch of resources digesting when those resources could be used for other things. I mean, I've always thought of, I was talking to Reed before you guys got here, I've always thought about the brain as kind of this biological governmental system. It's allocating resources, right? That's like its main job. It's deciding what is going on outside of the organism, and it's deciding how to reallocate all of the resources in the body to the appropriate centers to be able to do what it needs to do. And a lot of this is being done through this HPA axis. So this is something I don't want you guys to memorize all of the different stuff that happens in this axis, but I do want you to know that the hypothalamus and the pituitary are what are starting this process, and they're releasing stress hormones like cortisol from the adrenal glands. And so the way that this works is that the hypothalamus here releases this corticotropin releasing hormone that causes the pituitary to release adrenocorticotropin hormone. And so we're seeing that these are like messengers that are being sent down the road. It's like the old Pony Express. It's like, I want to get the body ready to fight. And so it sends a message to the pituitary saying, I want you to send messages to the body. And so that's what the pituitary is doing. And it sends this hormone all the way through the bloodstream. You got to think, this is a really vast, like biological distance that this stuff is traveling. I mean, when you think about how small the cells are that are releasing this thing, and your adrenal glands are like by your kidneys way down here in your torso, this message is going a really long way. And once it gets there, it's telling the adrenal glands, I want you to release cortisol, because cortisol is what is going to signal the rest of the body to get into fight mode. And cortisol itself is doing these things right here. That's what I was looking for. Is increasing the glucose levels. And so if you're increasing glucose, you have more energy available to be able to do motion and things like that. And it's decreasing the inflammatory response or the immune system that requires a lot of energy. And so if you're really stressed all the time, you're going to get sick easier. And you're also going to be more insulin resistant. We'll look at that on the next slide. But what happens is this is really important right here. Once the stressor is gone, if the stressor remains, then this thing just keeps going and keeps going. And that's what chronic stress is. We'll look at it in the next slide. But once the stressor is gone, what happens is if there's too much cortisol in the bloodstream, it actually signals back to the hypothalamus, we need to turn this whole thing off. And so it's this whole feedback system where the hypothalamus and the pituitary are telling the adrenal glands to release a bunch of cortisol. And then once the stressor is gone, if there's still a ton of cortisol in the bloodstream, then it tells the hypothalamus to turn this back off. And so the hypothalamus is actually using the cortisol as a signal. That's what we mean about a feedback system. This is kind of the end point of what it was trying to do, and then it's using that end point as a signal of when it needs to kind of turn this whole system off. And then once the HPA response is turned off, then we go back to homeostasis. So cortisol drops, we start getting back to normal glucose levels, start directing energy back to our digestive systems, and we kind of get out of that hyper alert area. But if the stressor remains, then this is something that kind of continues. And so what I want you to know is that the normal response, the normal stress response is supposed to be really short-lived. It's really acute. But if that thing keeps going, the two things on here that I really want you to take away are that your immune system is taking a huge hit, and this is what ends up leading to a lot of mood disorders. This cortisol is actually doing a lot in different parts of the brain. It's downregulating the prefrontal cortex. The hippocampus itself, something we mentioned in the last lecture, has a bunch of receptors for cortisol. And so when you're in really high stressful situations, not the best for studying, honestly, because it's actually shutting your hippocampus down. So try to relax when you're studying. Yeah. So lots of stress, kill your immune system and lead to these kind of longer lasting moods that are different than emotions. So I talked about arousal when we got into attention. This is not something I'm going to test you guys on, but this is just something to show that there are like systems down in these deep old brain systems, phylogenetically speaking. All of these different nuclei here. So there's nuclei here in the midbrain, and then there's some up here near the thalamus. This is the reticular system, and this is what signals the brain to go to sleep or wake up. And so if you do like sleep study work, if you do EEGs and you've seen like sleep spindles and K complexes and things like that, the sleep spindles themselves are originating here in the reticular system. So it's sending these signals out to the brain, like shut up and go to sleep. And these are really obvious. The people that do sleep studies, they can just sit there and watch, like, all right, he's going to sleep. Like you'll see this like massive spike of activity. It's just this thing telling the rest of the brain to shut up. So not something I'm going to test you guys on, but just kind of show that arousal itself is kind of this whole network as well of waking up and going to sleep. And that plays a huge part in the types of emotions that we're feeling, the kind of global state of the organism. So I'm sure you guys have heard of the limbic system before. So the limbic system was something that was defined by this guy McLean. And his argument here was that you have this old, so if you look at this picture, here in the middle is kind of the old brain that we talked about in the first couple of lectures. If we look back at like simpler animals and things like that, you have this like lizard part of the brain. And then as the organism got more complex, it started to build upon that older brain. And then here, this limbic system is kind of that next layer. And what a lot of these researchers think is that because most of the animals that have this layer are social animals, they think that this part of the brain was kind of evolved to help animals be social. And they think that that's what a lot of these emotions are signaling, are social signals themselves. So you don't need to memorize these brain regions, but these are the regions that kind of make up this limbic system. The hypothalamus, the anterior thalamus up here. You have the cingulate gyrus, which is this whole thing in green that kind of sits right on top of the old brain. And then the hippocampus that's kind of tied in here as well. And so this was something, at first, this was like the main circuit of regions that most researchers were like, this is the emotional brain. And they're very, very heavily involved in emotional processing, but they're also really heavily involved in other cognitive tasks as well. And so it makes this kind of hard to pin down. So what I want you to take away from this, though, is that the limbic system itself is not like an actual lobe or anything. It's a proposed group of brain regions that were believed to be responsible for this like social emotional thing that animals have. And it led to this localizationist view. So most of these researchers kind of near the beginning thought that there were these specific circuits for every single emotion. So when you're happy, it's the exact same neural activity. It's the exact same circuit that signals happiness every single time. When you're angry, it's this different circuit. I mean, this is just kind of a play example over here. This isn't something specific to the slide itself. It's just going to show that they were looking for these specific circuits that modulated specific emotions. And so the idea here, this was kind of their reasoning behind this, is that all mental states that kind of belong to the same category should rely on the same circuit. So if you're joyful, if you're gleeful, all of these different things that kind of represent happiness should all take part in the same circuit. And they thought that this was kind of an evolutionary adaptation, right? That circuit itself was created in animals specifically to make them adaptive evolutionarily. That if I create this type of behavioral response, if I'm happy when I'm in a social situation, then it's inferring some type of advantage to the animal. And because of that, they believe that these were inheritable, and that because they were inherited, we should be able to see these emotions in other mammals and other animals that are like us. And there's a lot of evidence that this is true, that there are emotions. And this was something that was really, really kind of big at the time. Kind of saying that that animals had emotions was something that was not really well accepted. And I mean, I don't know how many of you guys have dogs, but like my dog is happy and sad and angry, like tons of different emotions. So I'm like wholeheartedly in the belief that they do. But what kind of came out of this as we really started to pick this apart and really started to do brain imaging and things like that, we saw that instead of there just being one circuit, there's actually these networks, that there's specific brain regions. So don't memorize all of these brain regions. But there wasn't just one circuit for happiness. There wasn't just one circuit for angry or anything. These brain regions were all involved in kind of all of the emotions. And so this was just kind of the emotional network itself. And it wasn't necessarily that there was one pathway or something that was doing it, but it was different patterns of activity within that network that really signaled whether it was happiness or angry or sadness or something like that. There are certain regions that are more active for some emotions than others. And so there is some kind of circuitry that's specific. But as a whole, most emotions kind of involve this whole network type property, all of these regions kind of cooperating with one another and all kind of active at the same time. And this is a really big point, because this is going to be something I show you on the next slide. This is what neuroscientists are looking for now. Instead of just looking for what brain region was the most active during happiness or sadness, they're looking for what pattern of activity within that region is really predictive of that emotion. And so that's where we get into Luke Chang's work on this next one. I'll give you guys a second to take some notes. But the big takeaways here is that all of these emotions all rely on the same network of regions, and that what researchers are starting to do is starting to peer into those regions and seeing whether or not there are different activations within that, different constellations of patterns within those regions that kind of represent the emotion as a whole. And so that's what Luke Chang did with this work. Really, really cool work in 2015. This is kind of the forefront of MRI research, is multivariate pattern analysis. This is something that I do in my work, and it's taking the kind of traditional MRI approach one step further. So instead of just asking whether or not this brain region is active or this brain region is active, we're trying to peer into that brain region. We're trying to see whether or not there's patterns of activity in that region that means something more than just the fact that the region was on. And so this stuff at the top up here was just showing that, like, this was kind of the old way of doing MRI, of like, okay, we show that when they're viewing negative things, these brain regions are turning on. And there wasn't anything kind of significant that came out of that. But when they looked here, so these two things right here in the bottom are the actual voxels in these brain regions. So remember when we were talking about methods, a voxel is the kind of smallest unit of measurement that the MRI takes. And so every single one of these little cubes is coming out of these brain regions. And each of these little cubes has an activation value associated with it. That's how much that little part of the brain was involved in looking at a negative picture. And what he did was he took all of these different voxels from these brain regions, and he found that, so this was all from the amygdala in the first one, this was from the anterior cingulate cortex and from the insula. And he found that rather than just a brain region being on or off, that there were patterns, there was peaks and valleys within that activity that actually represented this negative affect, and that it was very different than pain, which we're seeing on the bottom. So even though pain is involving the amygdala and the ACC and the insula, there was a different pattern of activity when we were looking at negative pictures than there was when we were actually experiencing pain. And so he's able to kind of differentiate, even though both of them involve the same regions, there's something within those regions that's setting them apart. And that's where this is kind of the future of this research, is that we're starting to kind of take this approach with a lot of what we do. And a lot of this is only possible because of the computational power that we have now. I mean, this requires that we're looking at a lot of data. We didn't have the type of algorithms or things to do that in the past. And so I want to show you this really cool thing that you guys have access to. This is like one of my favorite things in the world that you can just like poke around on. So it's this thing called Neurosynth. And yeah, I show my RAs it all the time. So it has access to over 14,000 studies. And in those 14,000 studies, there have been 508,000 activations reported. And this is a computer program that goes through these studies and looks for a specific word in the abstract. And when it finds that word, it goes down and it pulls the brain activity from that paper that was associated with that word. And it does it across tons of different articles. And so you can just search a word and it pulls up where in the brain there's activity mostly associated with that word. So I'll show you this in a second. So there's 1,300 searchable terms in here. And you can also do these like functional connectivity things. So I'm going to click on this and I'll kind of show you what this looks like, because this is really fun to just play around with. So you go to neurosynth.org. This is kind of what the landing page looks like. So they have an example of, so this one right here, I think a different one pops up every time you come up. So if you just type in the word language, this found 1,100 studies that mentioned the word language in the abstract. And these were the regions that were the most active for that specific term. You can kind of use the slider bar here, and you can scroll through and look at these different things. So if you go up to meta-analysis up here at the top, and you go to terms, you can search a specific term. So let's search, I did it earlier. So we'll search emotion, because that's what we're talking about right now. And it found 1,037 studies. And these are the regions that come up the most when we're talking about motion. And so if you notice, we have on that last slide, we were talking about OFC, which is down here. We have the ACC, which is right here, that's implicated. We have these like thalamic regions in the middle here, these subcortical hypothalamus regions right here. So you see that this is like super robust. It's able to find these. You can like click around and view these different areas here. Really, really cool program. And you can actually even like download these full nifties and use them to like search your data. So this is a standard brain. And so this is a brain that was like an average of 152 brains. And then they just take the activity from those papers and then they plop it onto this average brain. And so really, really cool tool. You got to keep in mind there are limitations to this. It's just searching papers for a specific word. It's not seeing whether or not that paper actually like studied that specific word. But if that word is in the abstract, then it pulls that activity. But you're kind of losing all of that noise when you have 1,000 studies that you're all averaging together. So really, really powerful tool. And a lot of researchers are now using this to kind of double check their results. And they're like, okay, this is what I found. Like, what are other people finding? Super cool. Tal Yarkoni, Russ Poldrak, that whole group put this together, and they are freaking amazing. So really fun. If you guys want to pop around on this, like you can search all kinds of terms. You can do like self-referential. This is like stuff that I study. And you see really robust medial prefrontal cortex activity, like really, really cool tool. So I'll get back to the lecture. I'll stop playing. Cool. So this is kind of the future of this research, really trying to understand these things from a network approach rather than just trying to understand what brain region is involved, trying to see whether or not there's patterns within those regions. So this is just another example. This isn't something I'm going to test you on. But this is showing kind of how things are being advanced in a different way. So there are a lot of animal studies that show that this area of the brain, this periaqueductal gray, I hope I said that right, yeah, is really involved in animal emotion and in integrating tons of different emotions. And so this region in animals will light up for almost all of the different kinds of emotions. It's really heavily involved in all of that circuitry. And we haven't really been able to study it in humans. Humans have it, but it's way down in the midbrain, and it's 6 millimeters. It's this tiny little tube right here. But we have these new super powerful scanners that are like more than twice as powerful as the one we're going to show you guys on Wednesday, that are finally able to like really get down with fine granularity. And it was so powerful that instead of just showing whether this thing was on or off, it was able to section it into like different regions and see which regions were active for one versus another. Yeah. Cool. So This next part of the lecture will get into what a lot of people are trying to do now in like separating these different emotions, so that we can actually study the differences between them. And so you have this whole movie, Inside Out, was kind of around this idea that we can pull these specific emotions out and we can characterize them. We can see what kind of behavioral traits and things are associated with one of them. You'll notice this has 5 basic emotions. There's actually 6, according to the people that believe in basic emotions, but it was really hard to create a character that was surprised all the time. That's why they didn't have a surprised character. So this really started with Charles Darwin and William James. So Darwin was really tied into a lot of this biological stuff that was going on and trying to define evolution, and how things are passed down from one generation to another. And William James was kind of more in the psychological realm of things. This guy was really ahead of his time. His work is really, really cool. We'll talk more about him on next Wednesday, I guess, is when we'll have our next lecture. But he was really influential and really kind of challenging a lot of these ideas. So Darwin kind of came out first and was really in this mindset that emotions themselves are definable. They're specific. Like people that are happy always kind of have the same type of happiness. And because of that, they're kind of hardwired. So this was this idea that we kind of hinted at, that there was like a specific circuit that was dedicated just to being happy or just to being angry and all these kind of things. And so he was really arguing that there were these universal emotions that all of the higher order animals kind of all shared in common with one another, and that all of these different emotions kind of serve some evolutionary purpose. And William James was like, no, that's not right. Because these things, these states of mind, these like feelings that we subjectively create, are us trying to describe these physiological processes. The emotion itself is kind of after the fact when we're explaining it. So he's talking about like the perception of an emotion is actually assembled from all of these different things that are happening. And he was arguing kind of this is what we're starting to see, what I was just showing you guys, that emotions are not found in these dedicated neural structures, that they're more diffuse, that it involves a lot of these different cognitive mechanisms, and that it's really this kind of melange. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I can't speak French. That's just saying that it's kind of a mixture of all of these different psychological and physiological ingredients that kind of come together, and then we subjectively, after feeling all of these things, then we define it. And so he's saying that humans kind of have this innate ability to describe our feelings that are missing in a lot of these other animals. And so Darwin was kind of this idea that there are these universal basic emotions that all things share, and James was more of the belief that like perceptions of emotions are created. And that's kind of, we'll get into a lot of that in the next lecture, because that really defines how you're looking at the brain activity and what you're looking for, kind of. Are you looking for the perception of the emotion, or are you looking for the emotion itself? And that's kind of the distinction between the two. So basic emotions, so this is kind of coming from Darwin's approach, right? They're instinctual. They're something that are passed down. They kind of infer this evolutionary advantage. And because of that, a stimuli that makes you happy should kind of produce that same neural response every single time. That was kind of the idea behind this. And there's what you guys should kind of take from this. There's a reason why there's still people on both sides of this debate. And it's because there's evidence for both sides, and that there's really kind of some middle ground that we need to find, because there are neural responses, especially like in animals, that are very common every time they have some sort of emotional experience. So these things are innate, just means kind of like building on the premise that they're instinctual. So there's something that even before we learn them, we have them. So like babies can be happy and sad, things like that. And that they're shared between a lot of these higher order mammals. And they exist apart from the perception. That was something that was very different between Darwin and James, was that James believed that our subjective feelings were all perceptive. And Darwin's saying, no, these emotions are real, kind of outside of needing to perceive them or create some type of explanation for them. And so it was kind of tying this idea together. Like James would believe that all of these different things were different. So delightful and joyful and gleeful. Whereas Darwin would think that these are all just variations of happy. So James would think that like delightful involves very different physiological processes, and because of that, we're coming to a different explanation, a different conclusion about what those feelings are. And people like Darwin wanted to kind of categorize and lump everything into these kind of basic categories. And so we had this guy, Panksepp, a really big guy in like the animal emotional literature, that believed that we could study emotion in animals without subjective reports. So I kind of hinted at the beginning of the lecture that most of what we know comes from these subjective reports. But he found that when he stimulated these specific parts of the brain, that he was able to create very specific behaviors that were linked to what we would consider them having a specific emotion. And he kind of defined all of these emotions in this like approach and withdrawal type framework, that each of the different ones was either causing the animal to want to approach something, want to get familiar and investigate something or someone, or activity that was causing them to kind of go into a fight or flight type mode of wanting to withdraw from that situation. Anger and fear and things like that kind of fall into this withdrawal behavior. And so kind of fell under this I mean, we talked about this on the subjective report slide, that researchers kind of in this field were like, yeah, we can study it in animals because humans suck at reporting it anyway. Right? Like I can't trust subjective reports. And so all I have to go off of is behavior. And this really came out of this like behaviorist psychology type framework of like, we don't really care about the cognitive processes. We care about what we can study and what we can see. And this guy, he ended up coming up with these 7 different circuits that all kind of had these specific characteristics. So he had one circuit that when he stimulated it, they would go into this kind of seeking type behavior of investigating things. You have in this chart over here what he thinks is kind of the cognitive, perceptual version in humans of these different traits. But then you have like rage, where these really aggressive type behaviors that were triggered when he stimulated a part of the brain. Same with fear. This would be kind of a freeze type response in a rat. Get them to be super lusty. And then he had certain regions that would kind of trigger these maternal instincts. You'd have rats wanting to like lick each other and kind of groom each other. And then these kind of grief, distress type withdrawal. Like they didn't want to go around anybody. They just looked super sad. And then the last one was kind of this physical, social engagement of wanting to play with one another. And so there were specific regions of the brain. And so this kind of ties into this idea that maybe there are these inheritable, like underlying circuits of emotion. Problem is that it gets really muddy in humans. We don't know if that's because humans have kind of adapted and kind of moved away from these circuits and become more flexible. But this is noticeable in animals. And they've shown this not in just rats, but they've shown this in monkeys and other kinds of things like that. So there's a lot of evidence that there are these kind of instinctual type emotions that are driving a lot of our behavior. And facial expression is what really led to a lot of Darwin's type thoughts about things, that that the face itself is this really predictable cue into someone's emotional response. It's kind of what we were hinting at the beginning of the lecture. This was interesting. So this guy had total face anesthesia, so he couldn't move his face. And this guy found that if he stimulated certain certain circuitry within his face, that it could cause the facial expressions that represented different emotions. And so it was this idea that like that circuitry is there. If I just turn it on, I can get him to look happy or look sad or things like that. So this was another one of those arguments that maybe there is this innate kind of thing. And so this kind of set a lot of Darwin's thinking in line, that there were these kind of universal basic emotions. And Ekman, we'll talk about in the next one. So what I want you to take out of this slide is just that like faces themselves, we've talked about this, are really predictable of emotion, and that a lot of the early work was kind of around this idea that because facial expressions are very similar across people, that this is kind of evidence that there are these basic universal emotions. And Ekman, this was like in the 60s, so this was way after Darwin, is when a lot of this research started to pop back up. And he actually wanted to disprove Darwin. That was like his goal. He believed that there were there was a continuum that these emotions were on, and that it wasn't just happy or sad, but there was kind of a gradual progression from happy to sad, and that it wasn't just one specific thing, but something that kind of existed on this spectrum. And he thought that these facial expressions were socially learned, that as we engage with people, as we interact with people, that we learn how to cue these people with these facial expressions. And because of that, he thought that he would find evidence that they vary across cultures. But I'm going to do a little experiment with you guys in a second, because this is something that he ran into. Can you guys predict the emotion on this person's face? What's this first one? Happiness. Sadness. Neutral. Scowling. That's anger. Yep. And this one's a little bit trickier. Disgust. Yep. So disgust is kind of this that smells bad. I want to get away from it kind of look. This is what he ran into. So this is an indigenous tribe in Africa, right? His argument was that these facial expressions were socially learned and that they were supposed to be culturally specific. But we're seeing evidence here that these people that have never had any type of interaction with, well, they had interaction with him, not a lot of interaction with outside influence, still had these innate facial expressions, right? These kind of instinctual ways of expressing their emotion. And so he actually found that everything he was guessing, he found evidence to the contrary, that there was actually a lot of similarity across different genders, across different cultures. All of these people around the world all expressed these emotions in a really similar way. And it was this evidence for these kind of basic emotions. And he was the guy that kind of defined that set of 6 that I talked about when we were talking about the Inside Out movie. Yeah. So I want you to take away from this that Ekman, kind of contrary to what he thought, he actually did find some evidence for these basic emotions that were kind of consistent across people. And these were the ones they kind of added to this. These are kind of the core emotions that they came up with. And then they think that other emotions that we can report are kind of mixtures of these. And we'll talk about that when we get into complex emotions. But this is what I was just hinting at, was this study that they did with, they went and they observed facial expressions and body expressions of people at the 2004 Olympic and Paralympic Games that were competing in these judo matches. And they were seeing what they did when they won and what they did when they lost. And there was a good portion of these people in these matches that were congenitally blind. And so here down at the bottom is the kind of representation. So blue is what they were doing when they were winning. Green is what they were doing when they were losing. These are people that were able to see, and these are people that weren't able to see. And you see really, really heavy overlap between the two of them. There are different areas where it doesn't overlap, right? But it was this idea that the body language wasn't something that was learned. They never saw people pumping their fists when they won or something like that. And so it kind of showed that because of this really heavy similarity between these two things, that a lot of this stuff is instinctual. A lot of it is innate. And what they also found was some evidence for what you're saying. There were things that were socially learned. And so there were people from individualistic cultures displayed shame in a different way. And so that's something that they think that a lot of these kind of instinctual ways that we have for reacting to certain stimuli can be kind of flexibly changed as we interact with people and as we see what's appropriate to our culture and what's not appropriate. But this is really cool evidence that there is something kind of there, something that we never really learned. That we just want to yeah, I won. So At the end of all of this, Ekman kind of defined these criteria for labeling something as a basic emotion. There's a lot over here. I don't want you to memorize all of these. The main three that he came up with were that they were innate, so they were kind of these instinctual things that we're born with, and they're universal, meaning that they're found in all of these other cultures, and they're short-lasting. So that is something I really want you guys to take away, because I want you to be able to differentiate emotions from moods. Emotions are short-lasting. They're something that have like an identifiable trigger that set it off, and then they don't last very long. So this is something that there are, like fear and anger, there were things that we found in these other rats when we stimulated things. We've shown circuits that are specifically dedicated to these very specific emotions in their kind of subcortical circuitry. But it hasn't been as clear-cut in humans. And so there's kind of a continuum, they believe, of kind of discrete versus generalized emotions. This is just this idea that like we may have these instinctual kind of patterns of activity that are kind of recorded in our circuitry and in our brains, but our brain is able to be very flexible and is able to learn and adapt and change those things. And that may be why we're not finding things as clear-cut as we do in animal studies. So that kind of leads to complex emotions. So if you end up working in like the clinical mental health world and things like that, my wife used these a lot, these kind of feeling wheels to try to help people categorize and understand exactly what they were feeling. And so you start with these kind of core emotions here in the middle, but then as you kind of radiate out, you see that kind of mixtures between these can kind of result in much more complex types of emotion. And so this was kind of an example that like jealousy and romantic or parental love weren't considered basic emotions in like Ekman's chart. And his explanation for that was that a lot of these are really extended in duration. You can feel love for really long periods of time or jealousy for really long periods of time. And so it's kind of taking these basic emotions and somehow keeping them online for a really long time. And this was something that really drove a lot of his thinking, because he was really big into these facial expressions, and he didn't find any common facial expressions for these different things, right? Like kissing and holding hands down here are really clear indicators that you love someone, but you can totally fake that, right? So that's something that's not as innate, not as instinctual. And so this was kind of arguing that complex emotions are a lot more diffuse, that they kind of require a mixture of all these different types of things that are going on in these physiological processes. That these ones in the middle are super easy to identify. They have facial expressions that are common across all of these people, but as you radiate out in this circle, the more complex the emotion is, the harder it is to categorize, the harder it is to really find things that are consistent across people, and you start seeing things that are a lot more culturally defined on these like ridges of the circle. And so this was just an example of the jealousy and romantic love. Take this with a grain of salt, because this is definitely still in its infancy. And you see that one of the things that I wanted to point out here were that one of the reasons that we consider these things really complex. So this was a literature review that looked at all of these, kind of what we were just doing with Neurosynth, looked across all of these different papers at the activation that was happening during jealousy. And you see this really broad network of activity. And so it's kind of this idea that there's a lot going on here, a lot of different things that are being integrated. You have different social cognition areas that are kind of cooperating with theory of mind areas. Those are tying into some of the subcortical stuff. So a lot of stuff going on. And then same thing with romantic love. One of the reasons I say to take these with a grain of salt is like, how do you instigate jealousy while someone's sitting in a noisy tube? That's not the easiest thing to do. Like, think about someone cheating on you. I don't know. Like, I have no idea what type of stimuli they were using for this. And the same thing with romantic love. Like, they were trying to maybe show pictures of people that they loved or something like that. But there's definitely a feeling when you're holding someone's hand or when you're actually engaged in that feeling of love. That's a lot different than you might be able to get when someone's sitting in a noisy tube. Like, I don't want to be here. I don't love you. Yeah, so the idea here is not really to take what brain regions are active during all of this, but really to just know that these are really diffuse, that there's a lot of different stuff going on. And so that's kind of what defines it as complex. And so I'll kind of end with these dimensional theories. We'll get more into these dimensional theories next lecture. But the idea here is that this was kind of arguing against the idea of basic emotions. And this is really where the field is moving towards, is trying to understand things on these continuums rather than just as these like discrete, definable states that you can be. So these scales that are used most frequently, this is the one that actually is used the most frequently, is valence and arousal. So this defines emotions based on how pleasant or unpleasant they are and how aroused or not aroused you are. And don't confuse arousal with sexual arousal. This is just kind of global state. So you can be happy and aroused and just kind of be active, not aroused. But you can also, you can be happy and kind of aroused, or you can be ecstatic where you're really happy and really aroused. So there's a lot of kind of mixtures of those two dimensions. So just know that these dimensional theories are trying to explain emotions kind of on a continuum, kind of using these different good or bad versus like awake or not awake type things, or whether you want to approach something or withdraw for something. And so the valence one, valence and arousal, kind of is what I was just referring to. So how pleasant or unpleasant something is. And then arousal is kind of talking about the physiological state. So whether you're awake or not awake. And so you kind of see over here on this graph where some of these different emotions fall kind of on this spectrum, right? So if you're excited, you're really high in arousal, and you're also really high in positive valence. And then if you're calm, you're kind of low on arousal, but it's still a positive emotion. Whereas like tired is more on the low arousal, negative emotion. And then depressed is like low arousal and low negative, unpleasant. So it kind of talks about these things in intensity values, right? So instead of looking for neural correlates of a specific emotion, so instead of asking what part of the brain is active when they're happy, it's what part of the brain is active when it's pleasant and when they're in some type of global state. And so this is a very different way of looking for these emotions. And then approach withdrawal is kind of what we talked about with those animal studies. And so it's looking at actions and goals that motivate these emotions, whether you want to interact with somebody or whether you want to pull away from somebody, and kind of defining those emotions based on that. And that allows you to kind of explore some of these complex emotions in a different way. So, yep, and it's time. So this is just this idea that some things can be threatening, some things can serve as approach signals. And this last one was just saying it's still very divided. And knowing that it's divided allows us to really kind of navigate that territory. You can compare the different ideas from these different papers. Cool.